Hello. Before we begin, I want to talk a bit about this image. Viewers of my para videos should be familiar with it. I've used it in every prior video, and I'm using it in this one, and I may yet still use it in all subsequent ones. It comes from the Before You Act website, and it shows who among a sample size of maps attempted suicide at varying ages, the most common one, sadly, being 14. This image is preceded by a different survey, this time showing at what ages people in the map sample first had suicidal thoughts. The page says, "It may seem counterintuitive that the most common age of first suicide attempt is lower than the most common age of suicidal thoughts. This may be explained in a number of ways. It is possible that those with such thoughts at a lower age may experience them more intensely and may be more prone to carry them out. On the other hand, it is possible that those who carry out an attempt at an older age are more likely to succeed and therefore no longer be available to respond to our survey." That is perhaps the most harrowing thing about these statistics. They show unsuccessful attempts only. The successful ones cannot be polled. I dedicate this video to a viewer who supported the para community and has given me valuable feedback in the past. Pinkbo was a map and a friend to many in the community. He was very kind, friendly, and helpful. And when he watched my videos as I was starting out, he talked about how my anger in the "why telling paras to get help doesn't help" video triggered him, thus helping me realize that I should probably put warnings when I get too angry at aunties. This made it all the more saddening to learn that he had later accidentally outed himself to his family before he was ready. His family then cut contact with him. His own children called him broken and sick. From someone he loved, this was too much to take, and in the end he committed suicide, much to the glee of those who dared to continue to conflate the parent of minor attraction with being a potential predator in the face of evidence to the contrary, thus contributing to those suicide statistics. I've seen far too many youngsters gaslit and demonized for their attractions. Too many of them end up joining Pinkbo in death because of you bastards refusing, whether out of ignorance or malice, to stop spreading misinformation about us. Rest in peace, Pinkbo. You're now free from this world. I'm sorry I couldn't make it a better place for you soon enough, but I hope I can put a stop to this one day. Alright, time to get to work. I'm sorry that I've been away for a while, but I need to replace my desktop. Now I'm back to make what may be my favorite video yet. Today I'll be responding to this video by Duchess Celestia, or Paige, titled, "This art is never okay, here's why." In it, she targets Kodocons, she attempts to refute some of our arguments, she makes some of her own, and she uses several sources to do it, which is why this video is going to be a lot of fun for me, because there's a lot to tackle here, and she avoids, or at least tries to avoid, making many of the typical arguments anti-Kodocons tend to make. I've been wanting to tackle this one for quite some time. I have my own video defending Kodocon here if you wish to watch it. Now, to get something out of the way, I could not find Paige's pronouns anywhere. Not on her website, not on her socials, nowhere. It's the same issue as with Lagavert and Cinehusky in my last video. She seems to accept she, her, so that's what I'm using. But I apologize in advance if she'd rather I use different pronouns. Also, I will be discussing some grisly sexual content she attempts to avoid discussing. I don't blame her for this, I'm just giving a heads up. With that out of the way, let's hear what she has to say.
Hey guys, it's Celestia, and as promised, today's video is a follow-up to one of my other recent videos, which was discussing censorship in art. Specifically, in that video, I was explaining some of the most common perspectives on whether or not there was any kind of art that warranted censorship and should not ever be posted. and whether or not art could do any kind of measurable harm to real people through influence alone. Amongst the 3 main topic examples I discussed in that video, perhaps the most controversial one was love. And it wasn't just controversial because of what it is. It was also controversial because it was the only example that I openly disavowed as being objectively bad and harmful in all instances of its existence, which was something that a lot of people took issue with. I received an overwhelming amount of feedback, some of which was constructive and thought-provoking, and some of which was vitriolic harassment, from people who did not like that I took such an anti-lolicon stance. After reading through all of it, I found that a lot of people were repeating a handful of very similar opinions and perspectives, and I decided that it would probably be best to do a video focusing specifically on clarifying my stance and addressing these main primary arguments that I'd been seeing so many of. As such, since shortly after that video's release, I have been compiling all of my resources, all of which are linked in the description, contacting professionals, and planning today's video with a great deal of detail and thorough examination of the topic. I aim to address not only the criticisms made against my stance on lolicon, but also the most prominent and frequently used defenses of lolicon. And I will do so by presenting a combination of my own experiences, thorough research and documentation, and a full interview with a mental health professional that I consulted for their educated stance on the matter. As such, here's the obligatory trigger warning because by very nature of the video, there are quite a few, including lolicon, obviously, CP, CSA, and grooming. Please click away now if you find any of those topics upsetting. So, first of all, I'd like to make my terminology abundantly clear so that you know exactly what I mean and don't mean when I refer to lolicon. Lolicon refers to art that depicts underage characters in sexual situations or in a sexualized manner, and technically only refers to girls, with the term Kodocon being used for boys. For the duration of the video, I will be using lolicon as a blanket term to refer to both lolicon and Kodocon, as gender has very little bearing on the fundamental nature of the issues I'll be discussing. Furthermore, I do not mean art in which the character's age is not the focus, in which the character's age is unclear, or in which the character has been aged up to an adult, which is its own can of worms that I'll open in another video. The art that I'm criticizing and disavowing is that which depicts underage characters being sexualized because of their age, not despite it or irrelevant to it, with their age being the primary focus and the thing that is intended to make them attractive to viewers. Now, to save time and avoid repeating myself, I'm gonna play the segment from my previous video where I discussed lolicon, including the points made both against it and in defense of it, as well as my personal opinions and conclusions, and then I'll move on to addressing the main criticisms that segment received. Alright, topic 2, lolicon. This one will be a lot more straightforward because I personally find lolicon thoroughly indefensible. And while I will present the arguments without that personal bias, my conclusion will be very, very easy to make. See, this topic is kind of my example of a way that art actually does consistently and objectively hurt people, and fiction actually does affect reality in a severe and significant way. Gave you a topic with a hard answer, now it's time to give you an easy one. So, to avoid focusing on the actual nature of this topic for too long, there will be no examples in this section, and I will not be going into detail with my definition. Lolicon is art depicting intentionally and clearly underage characters in sexual situations, with that term specifying the character as female, while its alternative, Kodocon, specifies the character as male. I am not talking about art of characters with undefined ages that look like they could potentially be young or underage. I am talking about art that depicts characters that are canonically and clearly underage, being sexualized specifically because they're underage. Now, I will not be discussing arguments that defend lolicon out of any genuine belief that it's good. We all know what kind of people make those arguments, and I'm not going to waste my time or any of yours by even mentioning any opinion that defends it for the sake of defending it. The absolute only arguments that I'll discuss here are arguments that effectively acknowledge that it's bad, but argue for its right to exist on the internet, or argue that it doesn't harm real children and it shouldn't be treated as equal to things that do harm real children. So the first such argument, as I alluded to, is that sexualizing children in art doesn't hurt real children. I think this argument is largely hinged on comparing it being depicted in art to it actually happening in real life, which is fair, but the argument against this is the fact that lolicon should be judged completely separately from any real-life equivalent. Just because something worse exists doesn't mean that lolicon isn't bad, and while obviously no children are harmed in the making of art, children are harmed by the fact that it exists. Lolicon and Kodocon actively and consistently make actual minors feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and the normalization of its content contributes to the actual sexualization of minors.
She goes into more detail about this later, but what I want to talk about now is a generalization she makes here. I don't doubt that Kodocon makes some minors feel uncomfortable or unsafe. If minors are taught the wrong things about something and they just feel unsafe about it, should their feelings be a determinant in assessing its morality? If my existence makes a transphobic child feel unsafe, for example, I'm not the issue here. For the record, conflating pedophilia with CSA also makes some minors feel uncomfortable or unsafe for very good reasons, sometimes to the point of suicide. Also, I'd get onto her for using the term CP, but she's already apologized for its use in the comments, so I won't. Speaking of which, I'm also happy that she tries to differentiate Kodocon and CSAM, but I disagree that the former is a bad thing. As for the normalization of Kodocon contributing to the sexualization of minors, I'm going to hear her out first and tackle her arguments before showing my own.
Not only that, but while the creation of Lolicon doesn't hurt children, the content itself only caters to one group of people, and catering to that group of people does do actual harm in and of itself.
Which group? Maps? CSA perpetrators? People who enjoy cartoon kids? Again, she spills the details later, but she speaks about these things as though they're obvious and self-evident when they aren't. She knows this though, so I won't get on to her for being vague. I will later, however, for failing to adequately defend her position.
The other argument is that treating Lolicon and Kodocon like a big issue that people should unite against detracts from things that are actively harming real children. Most of these arguments, I've found, come from pro-shippers who claim that being angry about the sexualization of fictional minors in art diminishes the severity of things that are harming real children, or takes attention away from them. I understand that this argument comes from a place of genuinely just wanting the best for real minors, and I can acknowledge and appreciate that. But the counter-argument is nonetheless valid, and it's that people can focus on two problems simultaneously, all the while realizing that one is more severe than the other, while still disavowing and despising both. It's another case of people unintentionally diminishing the significance and harm of Lolicon because they're comparing it to a real-life equivalent, when they should instead just be seeing it as a separate issue. So in conclusion, yes, sexualizing actual children is worse than drawing sexualized art of fictional children. No, that does not mean that drawing sexualized art of fictional children is okay by any stretch of the imagination, or even vaguely justifiable or defensible. Its existence online does harm real children, it just harms them in a different way than a real-life equivalent would.
I've actually come across a theory for why Fanties in particular prioritize talking about Kodocons as opposed to real CSA. That it's a matter of power. Kodocons and other pro-shippers are far safer targets, particularly for minor Fanties, than CSA perpetrators, and Fanties feel they have more power to stop them, especially because Kodocons are much more willing to be open about their fetishes than CSA perpetrators are about their crimes. There may also be deflection involved, but I'll talk on that later. Now is when Paige returns to her main video, by the way, so now is when I get to get ready to combat the details of her stance.
So, that in mind, I'll now go over the biggest and loudest arguments against the points made in that segment, after which I will then address my responses to each one with both research and personal experiences. One of the biggest complaints I received was that I did not provide any proof that Lolicon could do actual measurable harm to real children. And this is completely valid because I actively chose not to for two reasons. The first of which is that I thought going into further detail would serve only to unnecessarily trigger people given the nature of the detail. The second of which is that, quite frankly, I thought it was common sense. We'll get into that. Quick note, that passive aggression there was only directed at the people using my decision not to include that proof to say that proof didn't exist and that Lolicon was fine. It's not directed at the people reasonably and fairly requesting those resources, who I hope to respectfully provide some clarity to with this video.
Putting your pronouns in your bio is also common sense these days. Where are they? Whatever the case, common sense is a poor argument. It's often contradictory and subject to change, and something being common doesn't make it right.
The next criticism was that I asserted that vent art and pro-shipping, the other two examples used in the video to discuss censorship and morality, were nuanced issues that shouldn't be treated as black and white. But then I proceeded to treat lolicon as black and white, which they considered unfair and unreasonable. Next, many others criticized that I acknowledged that in the case of pro-shipping, the things people enjoy in fiction don't always reflect their real desires, but that I did not apply that same logic to lolicon. This next criticism pertained to the comparison of lolicon to actual CP. As I mentioned in that previous video, many people criticize those who are against lolicon for hurting real children, because their focus on denouncing the sexualization of fictional minors in media draws attention away from real CP and the exploitation of actual children. I argued that the problem there is that people shouldn't be looking at lolicon and CP as the same thing or even on the same level, but rather as two things that are both bad separately. I posited that people could and should be mad at two things at once, while acknowledging that one was worse than the other, because they're two separate things and should be treated as such. I received some very reasonable feedback that the problem is that people are not doing that, and that disavowing lolicon so passionately and aggressively is ultimately resulting in people being angrier about fictional children being drawn sexually than they are about actual minors being harmed, even if that's not the intention when bringing attention to lolicon as a bad thing. Essentially, the failure to differentiate between lolicon and CP as separate issues has resulted in people taking the former way more seriously than the latter, and in my previous video, I did fail to acknowledge how serious of a problem that is. That said, I don't believe that this point requires a whole section later on to address it, because I don't think it'll take much time to sum up my response. Basically, I believe that while that's obviously true and a very serious problem, the solution isn't to suggest that people should be less angry about lolicon or less against it. I believe that the solution is for people to simply be angrier at CP and take it more seriously, while still maintaining an anti-lolicon stance. I can't stress enough that the differentiation between them is the most important thing, and that people should be angrier about CP than they should be about lolicon, but that should be achieved by staying angry about lolicon and just being angrier and more vigilant about CP. Not dismissing the significance of lolicon to bring more attention to CP, when the same result could be achieved by simply bringing more attention to the latter alongside the lesser but nonetheless present attention being given to the former. For example, Fumin recently disavowed a lolicon manga on Twitter, and used that issue to promote an anti-CP charity focused on protecting real children. She took lolicon seriously as a bad thing, while also bringing attention and funds to a worse, separate but related thing. That, to me, is the ideal situation that should be strived for.
I'd argue that before we become justifiably angrier about CSAM and other forms of CSA, we need to be smarter about where to direct that anger. As it stands, people are accusing the wrong people of being predators or potential predators. Maps, for instance, mainly do not commit CSA, nor are most cases of CSA committed by them, but even then, I'd argue that evaluations of what is CSA that don't include spanking and circumcision are outdated. Directing anger towards Kodocons and maps is a cruel exercise in futility, especially when CSA is committed by so many antis. In fact, I'd say, as I alluded to earlier, that's often a reason for the phenomenon of people being more angry about Kodocon than actual CSAM. It's a smokescreen. Since my last video even, Kyle Carosa was busted for CSAM after having contributed to one of the most horrific campaigns against a Kodocon artist I've ever seen. Which, again, is nothing out of the ordinary. This happens more quickly than I can document it, and of course, when it does, that's when people try to prevent us from pointing it out. Is this the kind of ire Kodocons deserve? Stay tuned and she'll tell us why she might think that may be.
Another argument I heard was that all art, regardless of its moral value, has a right to exist without being censored, and that's... honestly, in 99% of cases, I agree completely. Pondersprocket popped off about that, and I strongly agree with their takes, but I'll get into why I personally find this case to be the one exception to that later on. Next argument, people were not happy that I justified art that depicted minors sexually being posted in the form of vent art, but said it was not okay to post sexualized art of minors in any other situation. I'll be addressing this in a section discussing the moral difference between those two things, defined largely by the artist's motivations and the audience that they're deliberately targeting. Finally, the last criticism I heard a lot of was that I acknowledged that consuming violent media cannot make a non-violent person become violent if they didn't have those impulses prior to consuming that media, but didn't agree that the same could be said about lolicon. The people criticizing this also frequently posit, by extension, that saying people shouldn't enjoy, create, or circulate lolicon is the same as saying that people shouldn't make or play violent video games. This does not require its own section to address because the problem is right there in the criticism already. Violent media can only promote violence if the person consuming it was already violent, as I said, and therefore violent video games are not responsible for real violence. The only way they can influence a person to become violent is if that person was already inclined towards violence. That is not the case for lolicon. While violent media is not always consumed by violent people, lolicon is always consumed by people with pedophilic inclinations in one way or another. That means that 100% of the time it is influencing someone with existing predispositions towards children and subsequently can only serve to do harm, as I'll explain further throughout the video.
First off, as I'll talk about later, it's not just a matter of impulses. The US and its culture, for example, is rife with violence. You don't require impulses to be so. Furthermore, in the absence of education, video games can influence one towards violence out of wanting to emulate it. This sounds obvious, but it's a frequently overlooked factor that plays into, say, how our extremely poor sex education is a breeding ground for COCSA and harmful and incorrect sexual beliefs, like conflating pedophiles with predators, or conflating Kodocons with pedophiles, or Kodocons and predators. First off, what do you mean by pedophilic inclinations? Existing predispositions towards children? So she believes a pattern of attraction is sufficient grounds to consider one a potential predator against evidence? Kodocon, by the way, can, and often is, consumed by those with no thoughts or feelings about real children, a point she dubiously attempts to refute later.
Alright, so one more note before I begin addressing these specific arguments. I'd just like to say that while I disagree with anyone defending lolicon in any capacity, I genuinely appreciate everyone who decided to voice their thoughts and opinions respectfully and constructively. I still strongly disagree with lolicon and the people who support it, now more than ever, but I also feel like it's important and valuable for everyone to feel comfortable discussing their views and perspectives on it, and I feel like I've personally developed a more well-defined perspective myself after listening to those of others. My stance hasn't changed, but my argument and worldview have both broadened and improved, and I think that's what's so valuable about open debate and discussion. I hope that in the following sections of this video, I'll be able to better communicate some more well-rounded and developed opinions and points.
I feel like this is a bit disingenuous coming from you because later on you act as though you're adamant about closing debate and discussion on this topic, acting as though your stance has reached its endpoint, again, in the face of evidence to the contrary. I hope to not commit the same error after debunking your video here.
So let's start by addressing the criticism that I acknowledged that the things that people enjoy in fiction do not always reflect real desires, but I did not apply that to people who enjoy lolicon, and instead asserted that people who enjoy lolicon must always have some degree of sexual interest in real children. I stand by that differentiation wholeheartedly, but I also realize that I did fail to explain why, and I apologize for that. I intend to rectify that mistake here, and will be citing some of the resources linked in the description in the process, focusing majorly on an article by Christopher Bartel and Anna Cromaldi as I do so. Based on the nature of the arguments I'm about to present, this section will also be addressing people claiming that enjoying violent video games is the same as enjoying lolicon, as that's something that's covered quite succinctly by this section as well.
As she says, her sources are in the description. I will be addressing every single one of them, starting with Bartel and Cromaldi's article as she cites it, then going over what she doesn't cite, then moving on to the rest of them. Speaking of Bartel, I looked into him and saw that he wrote a book, Video Games, Violence, and the Ethics of Fantasy, Killing Time. I've yet to read this myself, but I read a review of it. It says that the book fails to explore some key areas of the wider debate. As a child playing Call of Duty, I, the reviewer, didn't possess the critical thinking skills required to absorb any message about the ambiguities of war, yet Bartel appears to not make the distinction between gaming as a child and as an adult. Again, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on how accurate I think the review is, but the mistake described in it is very similar to errors committed by those critical of porn, or indeed Kodocon, who fail to take into account the differences between those who consume it knowing very well that it's unacceptable in real life, and those who don't. This will be important later.
Okay, so, enjoying media depicting problematic subject matter does not always reflect real desires, and I stand by that stance while still disavowing Kodocon as something that does, objectively, almost always reflect real desires. And to explain why, I'm going to try to summarize what the article "It's Just a Story" describes as fictive imagining. A great deal of the following will be a combination of direct quotes and simplified paraphrasing for the sake of comprehensibility, but if you would like a more detailed explanation, I would recommend reading the article yourselves. Additionally, throughout the entire duration of the video, I will be censoring a lot of the language used in the articles I cite to avoid demonetization. So similarly, while the articles may be triggering by way of the terminology used, I do recommend reading them yourself if you're comfortable with that kind of language and feel that reading it directly as it was written is valuable to you. Alright, so, fictive imagining. To quote from the article, the act of fictive imagining is characterized by a suspension of commitment to the truth of the imagined content. This concept is elaborated upon later in the article via the following, which should more directly clarify what that means. When we imagine, we entertain Proposition X without being committed to Proposition X being true or false, as this imagining does not exist within any reality or narrative beyond our own minds. By contrast, when we fictively imagine, we entertain Proposition X as being true as represented in F referring to the fictional world that the imagining exists within. Artwork that prompts fictive imagining invites us to make believe that the contents of the fiction are true in some sense. Once engaged in the practice of fictive imagining, we are to obey its norms, one of which concerns inferences regarding the world. So basically, regular imagining exists outside of any connection to the real world because it does not take place in any world, fictional or real. Subsequently, the things imagined can be imagined without requiring us to apply the rules of any world to them. Conversely, fictive imagining, which is the kind of imagining prompted by our response to a piece of media, forces us to accept certain norms of the world in which that fiction takes place as being true, in a way that regular imagining does not. For example, I can sit here and imagine a dog eating a chocolate bar, and because that dog does not exist within any real or fictional world, that dog would be fine. In my head, he's actually having a really good time right now. If I were to instead imagine Marley from Marley and Me eating a chocolate bar, I would also by default have to acknowledge that Marley, as a dog conforming to that movie's fictional world that is subsequently allergic to chocolate, could easily get sick and die as a result of that chocolate bar. So in the first example, me enjoying imagining some random dog eating a Mars bar does not reflect a desire to see that dog get sick and die, because that dog exists outside of any world or universe in which it has to be allergic to chocolate. If I enjoyed the second example while knowing the consequences for Marley, that would reflect at the very least an ambivalence towards the dog's well-being, and at worst, a desire to see that dog suffer.
This is where I want to refer to Dr. Casey Lytle.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. The directionality of that correlation can be problematic because it's the same problem we have with criminal profiling, and that data comes from people who are known to have engaged in the behavior and been caught, not from everyone who has the fantasy. Violent, antisocial, and general taboo fantasies are extremely common. In fact, they're thought to be a normal way for the brain to process emotion and vent in a safe scenario without engaging in the behavior. It's only when those fantasies start to dominate and escalate that then they are risk. But having the fantasy itself is no indicator that you're at greater risk of engaging in the behavior. Video games get a bad rap. Anytime a school shooter is known to have played a violent video game beforehand, oh, the game must cause it. Well, if we look at the population of video game players, and we have done this, we find for most of them the game serves as a healthy venting without playing it out in real life.
So, here I am now, enjoying imagining my best friend getting graphically eviscerated, solely as a mental exercise. This doesn't mean I dislike her or desire any harm to come to her. Should what I just imagined were to occur in real life, I'd be saddened and horrified. Not even on account of the graphic nature of the fantasy, but because my real-life best friend would be hurt and killed. I could say that I'm imagining my best friend as a fictional entity separate from the real one, and you could make a similar case for Marley in your example as a separate being from the still fictional Marley depicted in Marley and Me. but I honestly don't think you need to go through those kinds of hoops. The article you're citing says on several occasions that such fantasies aren't always indicative of such a desire, only that they can be. For example, when I was a teenager in school, my friend would often relay violent fantasies they had about me to me on account of me being foolish or obnoxious or some shit. It was over 10 years ago and we're still friends to this day, and as far as I know, they didn't go on to commit any kind of violent crime against innocent people or anything like that. Violent fantasies, like your hypothetical one about Marley, are ubiquitous and aren't necessarily indicative of anything beyond perhaps a vent or imaginative exercise or a means of fulfilling a more visceral or sexual subconscious desire, the existence of which is also not indicative of a conscious desire to hurt anyone. Again, so says that doctor I cited and that article.
The article uses a different example, and while it's a much more disturbing one, it's nonetheless relevant to discuss, as it segues into the connection to lolicon if you haven't gotten there already yet. I'm gonna have to censor this a lot to be able to talk about it, so I once again encourage you to read the article if you want clearer and more direct explanations of the example used, although I also warn you that it is likely to be upsetting. Essentially, the article cites a particular piece of media depicting a woman who does not consent to the intimate activities shown and actively says no, but in the end is still depicted as having enjoyed what happened. The article says as follows, paraphrased: one could argue that, in fantasizing about the events depicted in this media, one is fantasizing only about fictional non-con, and thus that the imaginative activity is not morally blameworthy. Yet, in response, it could be claimed that the imaginative activity is open to ethical assessment, whether one is disposed to act on such fantasies or not. One way to make this argument is to claim that works like this prompt their audiences to develop beliefs or attitudes in their fantasy lives. In this case, the belief that a woman would enjoyed that happening, but in doing so, they prompt beliefs and attitudes towards their real-life counterparts as well. In fantasizing about a fictional woman who would enjoy non-con, for example, one is applying an attitude to the woman in the fiction, but one is simultaneously expressing an attitude towards women as a kind. As Barris Gott, and I really hope I pronounced that right because I'm gonna have to say it again, puts the objection, when the fantasist imagines his fictional women, he is imagining them as women, that is, as beings of a kind that exists in the real world. And that he imagines them as women is, of course, essential to his imaginative project. So all of that, put more simply, is effectively to say that were someone imagining non-con regularly, and not fictively imagining, it would have no implications about the way they viewed real women, because they are not imagining an actual woman. They're vaguely imagining the act in a world limited to their own mind. But by fictively imagining a woman in this situation as depicted by this media, this individual is conforming to the rules of the fictional world in which this woman represents an iteration or version of a real woman. And because the individual enjoys the media specifically because it's a woman being depicted, that does, by extension, force us to acknowledge that while the individual may not be inclined to support or even enjoy these events in reality, their enjoyment of it in this particular instance of fictive imagining must reflect certain beliefs and attitudes towards the real-life counterparts of the women in that media.
Perhaps, but those beliefs and attitudes could simply be that women are attractive. A heterosexual man or a homosexual woman are very likely going to center women in sexual imaginative projects. As the article states further, a man with lots of porn of redheads getting raped may be a misogynist using porn to satisfy his desires to see women suffer in the real world, or it may simply mean that he's into redheads and has a rape kink. I don't doubt this hypothetical man is a misogynist anyway, not because of the porn, but because of the misogynist culture we live in, making us misogynists in ways we often don't consciously realize at first. Another problem exacerbated by poor sex ed. I also don't doubt that there are, as a result, such misogynists out there who do consume this kind of porn or indulge in those kinds of fantasies, but as the article elaborates, we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. To go on a tangent, I'm reminded of the analysis that obese people tend to drink diet soda, and thus people sometimes conclude that drinking diet soda must cause obesity, rather than thinking alternatively, and more critically, that obese people concerned about their weight are more incentivized to drink diet soda to reduce their weight, and thus you see more obese people drinking them. I mean, that acesulfame potassium worked wonders for me. My point is that a similar analytical mistake can occur when we view perpetrators of sex crimes and see that they may have consumed porn, or have had those fantasies. I don't doubt it. That kind of stuff, as I said and demonstrated, is ubiquitous. But what's she saying? That those fantasies must reflect certain attitudes about women?
And as I'm sure you can guess, that can easily be applied to children as well. If one is enjoying Kodocon specifically because the character is a child within that fictional world, the act of fictive imagining forces us to acknowledge, by extension, that that individual has certain beliefs and attitudes towards real children, if the fantasy prompted by lolicon is only attractive to them because the character is a child. Which is, as Vera Scott put it, a being of a kind that exists in the real world. And the fantasy requires the character to be that being of a kind that exists in the real world in order for that fantasy to be appealing.
So here we're shifting gears from porn presumably containing real people acting them out, to fictional children who look nothing like real-life children. If someone finds Kodocon hot, the belief they have is they find Kodocon hot. It's even possible for people to find Kodocon attractive specifically because of their age, and not extend that attraction to real children because real children don't look appealing to them, like how real kittens or baby deer may not. Attraction doesn't conform to arbitrary rules. There are a number of maps who don't find Kodocon attractive, despite your logic seeming to dictate that they should. Even then, a belief that real-life children are attractive isn't any more an indication that someone's a dangerous predator than a belief that real-life women are attractive.
It's at this point that I'd like to address the point that this logic could also apply to pro-shipping, which brings me back to the criticism I received, that I acknowledge that in the case of pro-shipping, fantasizing about inappropriate or unacceptable relationships, so long as they didn't involve minors, did not always reflect real desires, but I did not extend this to lolicon. Again, I stand by that, and here's why. Let's go back to that previous example of the non-con porn, and discuss the hypothetical individual enjoying it. If this individual is enjoying the media because they enjoy the thought of doing that to a woman specifically, I would assert that based on our understanding of fictive imagining, that would indeed reflect the way they actually see real women, as the fantasy is dependent on the fictional woman being involved. But that is not the only reason a person might enjoy that media. Conversely, if that individual doesn't care about the gender of the person in that media at all, their enjoyment of it obviously wouldn't reflect any real views on women. Instead, they could be motivated by a desire for the act, for the situation, for the dynamic. There are a plethora of reasons that could motivate the individual that do not have anything to do with the woman, or, by extension, their views about women. Similarly, in the case of someone enjoying violent video games, there are a plethora of reasons that a person could derive enjoyment from that do not reflect any real desire to hurt others, nor does it make people violent. But in the case of lolicon, at least as long as there is no scenario involved in it and it's exclusively the character that's the subject of the fantasy, there is no other possible motivation for the individual enjoying it to enjoy it, because the only thing drawing them to that media is the age of the character. There is nothing else about the media that could appeal to them aside from the age, and by the nature and rules of fictive imagining, that does reflect the individual's views on real children. I didn't say that the things pro-shippers enjoyed in media could never reflect real desires, but rather that they did not always reflect them by default, and that's based on this logic. And similarly based on this logic, I feel confident in my assertion that enjoying lolicon does always reflect them by default. I hope this more detailed explanation was able to bring some much needed clarification to those assertions.
It did not. More conflation between Kodocon and real porn. With regards to the real porn, again, the view or belief may simply be that the user finds women attractive. There are many things that are misogynist, but finding women and not men attractive is not among them. We can't help what turns us on, no matter how hard conversion therapists try. Unless they try to convert us from living people into dead people. Aunties seem to like that.
Now, delving further into some of the other arguments with that explanation as our foundation, others claim that even if enjoying Kodocon did reflect real desires and views towards real children, it still did not do harm by existing and being posted and shared because it still couldn't harm real children. I'll go into the other ways that it can do harm to real children in more detail a bit later on in its own section, but I'd also like to acknowledge this particular way here, because the article does a great job of explaining it. It posits that active fantasy can influence an individual's real views over time if those fantasies are indulged through media. It also explains, effectively, why even fantasizing about underage characters without any intention to act on those fantasies is still morally reprehensible. To elaborate further, I'd like to return to that article and read you guys some more of it, again with the necessary paraphrasing and censoring. An individual's fantasies play some distinctive role in that individual's mental life. Our fantasies are often, but not always, indicative of our desires. Sometimes we desire things that would be immoral to pursue in real life. Actively fantasizing about something that is desired can aid in the cultivation of that desire, and there are some desires that it would be immoral to cultivate. When consuming porn, an individual does not merely entertain fictive imaginings. The individual's desires are also engaged. An individual may use porn as a way of satisfying an immoral desire, and by satisfying it, one may further cultivate that desire. First, it is important to clarify what kind of fantasies we're talking about. We are not categorically criticizing all fantasies. Many of our fantasies are beyond our control. Sometimes we engage in fantasy passively. Think of those cases where a thought arrives unbidden and sometimes unwelcome. Such passive fantasies are involuntary. Alternatively, active fantasies are voluntary. They are imagined scenarios that we return to time and time again determinedly. These are the stories that we deliberately tell ourselves, the fantasies we develop, refine, and relish, ones that take up a significant portion of our imaginative mental lives. There is a morally relevant difference between active and passive fantasies. For instance, it would be one thing to passively entertain a fantasy about an acquaintance, but it's another thing to will that fantasy to mind. The core of our argument hinges on three claims: that porn engages the consumer's desires as well as their imagination, that some desires are immoral, and that it is immoral to cultivate such desires through fantasy. Beginning with that first claim, consider what is involved with one's engagement with porn. Understood that the appreciation of fiction requires the consumer to engage imaginatively with it, thereby treating the scenarios depicted within it as true within fiction. By contrast, porn calls for more than imaginative engagement. When consuming it, one is not simply entertaining a fiction, rather one is getting off on it, and that is the wording used in the article. Appreciating porn requires one to not only imaginatively engage with that content of work, but to also find that content attractive. When it comes to the extent to which what one finds attractive reflects their desires, much could be said. But we could at least say that this media typically aims to appeal to the consumer's desires for a reason. Turning to the second claim, we must ask, are some desires immoral to hold even when those desires are not acted on outside of fantasy? There is some reason to believe so. Consider a person who holds racist beliefs but never acts upon them. Imagine that it is simply a matter of moral luck that this person lives in such a closed society that they never find themselves in a situation where they may act on their racist beliefs. Regardless of this contingency, it is still morally wrong for someone to hold racist beliefs. The same could be said of desires. Pedophilia is a bad desire to have, even if one does not act on it. An individual would be better off, morally speaking, without such desires.
There are several mistakes being made here. First, I'll tackle the age-old comparison of sexual preferences and fetishes to racist beliefs. You can choose to be racist. You can choose to eliminate racist beliefs society may have instilled in you. You cannot control nor change what you're sexually attracted to. Yes, someone holding racist beliefs is bad whether they plan to act on them or not. Patterns of attraction are neutral. If someone violates a child, the problem isn't that the perpetrator acted on a pattern of attraction, but rather that they harmed a child. I think this is a very important distinction to make based on the evidence I showed earlier, so that we can better combat CSA instead of scapegoating innocent people often to death. There's also a massive difference in the context surrounding racist art or fiction, at least the ones often cited, and it's one of the things that reminds me of the criticism that review made of Bartel's book, and that antis often fail to realize this. Racist fiction is often made and used as propaganda to exploit gaps in people's knowledge and influence them into thinking certain ways. Meanwhile, Kodocon is usually tagged and consumed by people who know damn well what CSA is and why it's bad. Hell, it's often consumed and made by victims of CSA. I agree that having a harmful belief is bad, whether it's acted on or not. Liking Kodocon is not indicative of having a harmful belief. But calling pedophilia a desire to be compared to racism is indeed a harmful belief.
One might then wonder what kind of moral theory is required to justify the claim that desires are immoral. It would be beyond the scope of this essay to take up this issue in much detail. However, we suspect that this claim can be defended by any number of theories. For instance, some consequentialists might argue that the possession of an immoral desire by an individual unacceptably raises that individual's risk to perform such acts. Deontologists, and I hope I pronounced that right, might argue that immoral desires diminish our capacity to treat others with respect. Virtue ethicists might argue that the individual's possession of an immoral desire is damaging to their moral character. It is sufficient for our purposes to say that the morality of desire is not implausible, although it may be an underexplored area of ethical theory. Some might object that it is better to satisfy an immoral desire in fantasy than in reality, so individuals should not be held morally blameworthy for fantasizing about immoral things. This objection may seem intuitive, but it is weak. It shifts the focus of the argument from the cultivation of immoral desires to their satisfaction. We are not so much worried about finding out what is the best way to satisfy an immoral desire. Instead, we are interested in cautioning against the cultivation of immoral desires. Even if it is better for an individual to satisfy an immoral desire in fantasy than reality, we can still maintain that it's morally wrong to cultivate an immoral desire. Basically, simply put, one thing being worse doesn't mean the first thing isn't bad. Moving on to the last section, the article continues. We can now turn to our third claim, that it's morally wrong to cultivate immoral desires through fantasy. When we say that a desire can be cultivated, we suggest that desires can be reinforced and refined by seeking out the desired contents. Aestheticians are well aware that one's taste in art, or food, or drink, or whatever, can be cultivated and changed through practice. We suggest that desires can be cultivated the same way. Classical conditioning suggests an obvious psychological mechanism for the cultivation of a desire. If the engagement with some content is consistently rewarded with pleasure, then the association between pleasure and that content is reinforced. Which is basically to say that if the content is immoral, cultivating an association between that content and pleasure is, in and of itself, immoral, which is further to say that enjoying lolicon serves to further reinforce a pedophilic desire, which is already a form of harm done to real children, because reinforcing pedophilic desires increases the risk of people possessing those desires acting on them in reality. For anyone interested, both the article and this video's resources provide empirical evidence of the link between frequent indulgence in immoral sexual fantasies and an increase in actual real crimes against the victims being fantasized about.
She makes the diet soda mistake I discussed earlier. I don't doubt sexual perpetrators fantasize about sexual stuff. I'll go over the evidence and sources later, after she stops citing this article. It's definitely dubious. The other stuff she says here I covered earlier. Liking Kodocon isn't any indication of someone having a so-called pedophilic desire. Neither is having the pattern of attraction any indication that someone's in danger of committing CSA. Though, it is an indication that they're in danger of committing suicide. Does cultivating homosexual desires increase the risk of someone raping someone else of the same gender? Absurd.
Furthermore, the article goes on to say the following. Lietenberg and Henning report that most treatment programs for sex offenders to directly modify fantasies. This is telling. If fantasies can be modified, then this result must be achieved through the cultivation of another desire. Moreover, if porn can be used to positively modify the fantasies of some, then why should we not think that it can't also negatively modify the fantasies of others? Put simply, there is objective proof that media can influence and change our desires, as well as our risk of indulging those desires. Subsequently, there is proof that lolicon can influence and worsen the pedophilic inclinations of those who enjoy it, and thereby increase their risk of hurting real children.
Oh dear. I took a look at Lietenberg and Henning's report that the article cited. It says there is no evidence that sexual fantasies by themselves are either a sufficient or necessary condition for committing a sexual offense. It also says Even fantasies about sex with children and arousal to sexual imagery of children do not, by themselves, indicate that someone is a child molester or has a strong potential to be a child molester. For 1995, this article is promising, but it does show its age in some places. It uses a DSM-3R definition of paraphilic fantasies, meaning that they're only paraphilic when it distresses the person having them or they act on them. The DSM-5 has changed that since, but I still go over my problems with it in this video. The paper also cites lack of victim empathy, distorted beliefs about consent and harm, feelings of hostility towards women, endorsement of rape myths, feelings of masculine inadequacy, feelings of emotional loneliness, and lack of intimacy, and dysfunctional sexual and family histories as risk factors for committing sexual offenses. Victim empathy is not a term I'd use here. Having no empathy doesn't make you a bad person, and hyper-empathetic people can rape too. Compassion may be a better phrase. I strongly agree with some other reasons. The distorted beliefs, hostility, rape myths. Keep these in mind because I want to talk about what this report talks about and what got it cited by the Just a Story article and by extension Duchess Celestia. The article says that this report says that most treatment programs for sex offenders use porn to modify fantasies. Does this set off any red flags to any of you yet? Let's look deeper into this. First, it says that researchers in the 1960s and 70s believed that deviant sexual arousal was a central cause of sexual offenses. Oh dear, the diet soda problem. Figures. Because offenders usually reported having sexual fantasies about the types of behavior in which they engaged, most initial efforts at treatment were directed towards developing techniques for suppressing inappropriate arousal and fantasy, and increasing appropriate arousal and fantasy. The two major behavior therapy approaches used were either some form of masturbatory reconditioning or aversive conditioning. Yikes. You know what this is, don't you? This is conversion therapy in all its harrowing, sexually invasive, ineffective glory, as the report goes on to say. But first, it also says, if it were true, as was generally assumed, that sexual fantasies were reinforced as a result of being paired with sexual arousal and orgasm during masturbation or other sexual activity, common sense suggested that masturbation could also be used to change fantasies. And thus, this report also ends up proving my point that common sense isn't always right, and it's a terrible, often contradictory thing to cite. First, the report cited a case where offending men were to masturbate to their deviant fantasies and to switch to appropriate ones at the time of orgasm. The goal was to wean them off of the deviant fantasy and theoretically correct their behavior. The process was described by an individual who, in an uncontrolled series of 14 cases, reported results in support of these expectations for 12 of them. Someone else combined it with an aversive conditioning procedure and found that 11 people out of a mixed sample of pedophiles, fetishists, and rapists showed decreased arousal to inappropriate fantasies and increased arousal to appropriate fantasies. Several other uncontrolled cases reported seeming success, so this kind of procedure started to become routine. The report goes on to say, unfortunately, the masturbatory reconditioning technique was often used in conjunction with aversive conditioning procedures designed to reduce the arousal properties of the deviant stimuli. Thus, an independent assessment of its effectiveness usually was not possible. Long-term follow-ups also were not conducted, so it is unclear whether changes could be sustained over time with this procedure. In addition, a controlled study with a small sample of homosexual men who expressed a desire to switch the content of their fantasies to heterosexual imagery suggested that this technique alone could not be successfully used for this purpose. Although homosexual men obviously represent a different sort of sample from sex offenders, this result raised questions about the effectiveness of the technique for changing long-established fantasies in sex offenders as well. The report then talks about masturbatory satiation, where people are to masturbate to deviant behavior after orgasm, while having their fantasies tape recorded. The report says because this procedure is usually in a treatment package with multiple components, convincing evidence of its independent effectiveness is lacking. In short, despite their face validity, it is far from certain that masturbatory conditioning techniques, in isolation from other therapy components, work to permanently change fantasies or behavior in sex offenders. There was also shock aversion therapy, which had questionable lasting effects. Then there was covert sensitization, where people are shown or described images of the deviant acts that arouse them, paired with images or descriptions of aversive events. One person, Maletsky, used this on large sample sizes of offenders in conjunction with the odor of valeric acid and rotting flesh, and reported a success rate of over 90% in changing fantasies, arousal, and behavior, though not all of these men were treated exclusively with this procedure. I looked into one of Maletsky's studies, and he admitted that the means he used to measure his success, that being boner detectors and self-reports, were unreliable, especially when, as he points out, the patients would have every incentive to appear as though they've improved, or to believe they have, especially under stress from loved ones, the legal system, or internalized pareidolia. The study was from 1980, so, of course, homosexual pedophiles were what it called men who committed CSA against boys. Covert sensitization was developed for the purpose of curing homosexuality, in fact. I'm not saying something made with a bad purpose in mind can't be repurposed for good, but as Leitenberg and Henning's report points out, the ethics and effectiveness are dubious. It goes on to show how treatment correcting rape myths, personal management skills, and a lack of compassion for the victim proved more effective. Many conversion therapy methods are paired with these other methods, further putting into question their effectiveness. Furthermore, Leitenberg and Henning's report also says that attempts to suppress certain fantasies, rather than accept them as normal, may backfire in a manner similar to what occurs in obsessive-compulsive disorders. Unwanted thoughts may increase rather than decrease the more a person tries not to have them. This line of thinking is consistent with the recommended and most effective treatment for intrusive thoughts: exposure as opposed to avoidance. Accepting them for what they are. Thoughts. As an ex-ante, I can say this worked wonders for my mental health. There was also talk of libido-inhibiting drugs, but that misses the point, as I'll get to in a minute. So, hooking people up to boner detectors and forcing them to undergo sexual fantasies. Already there's a problem. Many vagina havers are also MAPs. But the point is, if we accept that fantasies can be changed, that still misses the point, and it's why the more compassion and education-focused treatments are more effective. Someone breaching boundaries and committing sexual abuse is a different problem entirely. Their fantasies and orientation may influence their choice of target, but their willingness to abuse is the problem here. I don't doubt that there are many people out there who committed CSA that have CSA-centric fantasies, much like I don't doubt how homosexual rapists may have fantasies centered around victims of their preferred gender. It's a very shallow analysis. This, of course, assumes that these conversion therapy treatments are effective, which the reports admits that their effectiveness cannot be assured. Frankly, I see conversion therapy like this as legally sanctioned sexual abuse, and as I've covered before, such techniques, boner detectors, unsolicited porn, fantasy, shock acid, emotional manipulation, and all, were employed on children who are MAPs, or suspected of being MAPs, or who have committed COCSA. When mental health professionals don't commit sexual abuse legally, they tend to do it illegally. The report also spoke of the high percentages of people reporting minor attracted thoughts among people surveyed, and said that the number is likely to be higher due to the stigma preventing people from admitting or realizing their patterns of attraction. According to Before You Act, 0.5 to 5% of males have a preferential attraction to minors. That's 40 to 400 million people, and that doesn't include those who simply have the attraction, just not as their primary one. That also doesn't include women and non-binary maps such as myself, and it, again, is likely an underestimation. The number is likely to rise as accurate information and destigmatization spreads. Leitenberg and Henning's report says that sexual fantasies are ubiquitous, even among children. That they're not dangerous, and that treatments that influence offender behavior instead of targeting fantasy with dubious effectiveness are more successful. Bartel and Grimaldi, in their Just a Story article, make a short mention of the existence of fantasy modifications in treatment programs, and proceed with their article as though it's telling proof that they can be modified in those kinds of ways. No mention or analysis whatsoever of the nature, effectiveness, or necessity of these attempts at modification. So I asked Duchess Celestia, you believe censorship is bad except for when it's applied to Kodocon, right? Do you believe that something as draconian as conversion therapy, that legally sanctioned sexual harassment and abuse, is bad except when used against the tens or hundreds of millions of us maps and uncountable number of Kodocons who have done no wrong in the hopes that such a thing might, just might, change our patterns of attraction and fantasies? Do you think that such a thing is feasible against our numbers? This is absolute foolishness.
Alright, so the next criticism I want to go over is why I believe that even morally bad art should not be censored, but still simultaneously believe that Kodocon should be. First of all, I would strongly recommend watching Ponder Sprocket's video on the topic of censorship, linked in the card above, and reading the article, The Ethical Criticism of Art, linked in the description. The former presents a very comprehensive defense of why even immoral or offensive art has a right to exist without being censored, and the latter provides a succinctly, clearly worded summary of the relationship between morality and art. I'm referring you to both because, with the one single exception of Kodocon and other art that depicts children sexually for the explicit purpose of appealing to people attracted to that, I agree completely that no art should be censored, morally bad or not. Because as I said in my previous video, morality cannot be quantifiably measured, as it's a concept that does not have one single definition, but is rather defined by each individual's personal perception and understanding of it. But Kodocon is different, at least from my perspective, and I'd like to refer back to the It's Just a Story article to explain why. The article informs us that for a brief period of time, computer-generated CP was protected under the First Amendment as free speech in the United States, based on the same argument that so many people are using to defend Kodocon, that no real children were harmed in its making. While there has been a great deal of debate and inconsistency surrounding the illegality of this since then, the research that I found states that it is no longer protected under the First Amendment. The article posits this stance as why. Perhaps it is true that for some individuals, the things they find attractive in fiction are unrelated to their real-world desires. But it is also true that many do turn to computer-generated CP to feed a real-world desire and thereby refine their tastes. God, I hate that sentence. So while we accept that an individual may desire something in fiction that they would not desire in reality, we reject the stronger claim that acts of fictive imagining are always sufficiently bracketed out from the individual's real-world desires and beliefs. When an individual engages in an act of imagining to cultivate an immoral desire, then that individual's act of imagining should be open to moral scrutiny, as their imaginative engagement is not genuinely bracketed out from their real-world desires. That alone should be enough to communicate why I believe that Kodocon should fall under the reasonable scrutiny of censorship. Even the law says that fictional images depicting children, even when they're not real children and no real children were harmed in their making, that's potentially dangerous enough of its own merit by appealing to the desires of predators and allowing them to cultivate those desires.
Appeal to legality. Also, convenient omission of the following couple of sentences. The article states, "We are not arguing that it is categorically morally wrong for any person under any circumstance to enjoy fictively imagining, ergo, a rape fantasy scenario. What matters, morally speaking, is whether the desire being served by fantasy is an immoral one or not. Also, computer-generated porn is defended the same way, and the defense is valid the same way, so long as no real child was involved in its creation. I've gone over most of this already. If Kodocon is sufficient to motivate someone to commit an offense who wouldn't otherwise, that's a problem with the offender."
Finally, last section before I tackle the biggest section of how lolicon harms real children, is why vent art is different than lolicon when it comes to the significance of the artist's intention. Again, I'm going to refer back to a section of the article, which is as follows. Is it ever wrong for an artist to prompt their audience to fictively imagine something immoral? Others believe that it can only be wrong when the artist intends for their fictional work to promote or justify the real-world equivalent. But we offer an extension to that. Artists can both be held morally responsible for prompting their audience intentionally to fictively imagine something immoral, when they have a reasonable expectation that their audience will derive a real-world belief or desire from it. But they should also be held responsible for when their work is made and shared in such a way that, whether intentionally or not, it allows the audience to use the work to cultivate an immoral desire. Our account aims to capture two sorts of cases. Those cases where the artist intends for their audience to use their work to cultivate an immoral desire, and those cases where the artist neglects to guard against such uses of their work. In our view, many works are morally problematic simply because of their negligence. First, consider what our account allows us to say about the case of computer-generated CP. The producers of this content are morally at fault because their intention is for their audience to derive beliefs about what is appropriate regarding the treatment of real children from their media. The producers of such work aim for it to be attractive to consumers, and whether those producers find it attractive themselves or not is irrelevant. All that's relevant is that the work's producers had the belief that its contents would be attractive to its target audience. Finally, our account allows us to avoid excessive moralizing. For instance, consider Nabokov's Lolita, which has been widely praised for its success in presenting the character of Humbert Humbert in a sympathetic light. As a work of literature, it is reasonable to expect that wrestling uncomfortably with such sympathy is the artistic aim of the work, and success in this regard counts as a literary success. Of course, this does not preclude the possibility that some readers might ignore the work's psychological depth, and superficially read only the racy parts for their own pleasure. In this case, the reader can be held morally responsible for their use of the work to cultivate an immoral desire. But these readers are atypical, and are not treating the work as Nabokov intended. Subsequently, while those readers are morally wrong, Nabokov should not be held responsible for those atypical readers. I'm quoting this section to attempt to use those differences in situations to illustrate the difference between lolicon and vent art. In the instance of lolicon, the artist either knows that they're catering to predators, or they're simply failing to realize that their work will cater to predators, and they're to blame in either case. In the instance of vent art, the artist's intention is to only appeal to others who are dealing with what they have, and will interpret the work for what it is, a way to cope with trauma, and not something that is attractive. Even if some viewers do use vent art to cultivate immoral desires, as the article would word it, they are atypical viewers, and subsequently, the artist should not be blamed for their failure to view the work as what it is.
Been over this too. Someone actively trying to cultivate racist beliefs through their media and such should be held accountable, yes. However, Kodocon is made to appeal to an extremely common sexual desire in an environment full of people able to realize that such a thing would be wrong in real life. That such content can be weaponized by predators doesn't mean the creator should be held accountable any more than knife makers should. This is the point, by the way, where she stops citing that article and any other, and shifts to her personal anecdote and her conversation with a mental health professional. So this is where I'll go through all of her sources and see what they have to say. Like, finishing up side quests before the endgame. First off is the one she kept bringing up. Bartel and Cromaldi's It's Just a Story, Pornography, Desire, and the Ethics of Fictive Imagining. The empirical evidence it cites comes from Leitenberg and Henning's report, which is that sex offenders have sexual fantasies. Diet soda. They also usually have 2 legs, just as most people do. It also cites another article that page does, which I'll look at in a little bit. It also says, "We do not claim that a direct causal link can be observed universally between the enjoyment of rape fantasies and actual acts of sexual aggression. As Malamuth, Addison, and Koss report, for the majority of American men, pornography exposure, even at the highest levels assessed here, is not associated with high levels of sexual aggression. Instead, our point is that some individuals will fantasize about immoral acts as a means of reinforcing already held desires, and in doing so, these individuals are cultivating those desires." It says towards the end, "Our claim is limited, and we think rightly so. It is limited to the misogynists of the world. So, not to everyone who consumes porn or possesses sexual fetishes. Again, I don't deny that porn or media could motivate someone to commit heinous actions. I don't deny the media could cause such a thing. But this kind of analysis is tunnel-visioned. It focuses on the relationship between the user and the media entirely within a vacuum. It fails to take into account surrounding circumstance, the user's education, society, upbringing, etc., their ability to be prepared to consume this media, their ability to understand it." Getting ahead of myself a bit, Malamuth, Addison, and Koss look to American men for aggression and porn statistics, which is telling all on its own. Of course, our godforsaken culture, with its extremely poor sex ed and its toxic masculinity, is a breeding ground for entitled, aggressive men who would probably enjoy violent porn out of misogyny. I also don't doubt that much of the porn produced is made by misogynists for misogynists. Atypical viewership still applies here, though. One could not be a misogynist and still possibly find such porn arousing, even if they find it morally appalling, whether in its creation or in its message, because guess what? We're humans with sexual fetishes. As misogyny becomes eradicated, such viewership may become the typical viewership. The problem with this kind of content isn't whether or not one finds it sexually appealing, but rather whether or not one, in the absence of good sex ed or a multitude of other factors, learns from it, or worse, supports the exploitation that occurs in its creation. And there is a lot of exploitation that occurs in the porn industry. And that's a major difference. Kodocon requires no exploitation to create whatsoever, and is quite frequently made by, shared by, and consumed by victims who know full well how bad CSA is in real life. In fact, they often fall victim to antis who oppose Kodocon, like Kyle Carrozza. Alright, second on her list is... I'll be damned. It's Leitenberg and Hanning's report. The one I went over already, the one Bartel and Cromaldi cited as evidence that sexual fantasy can be modified. Honestly, I goofed. I legit forgot Page listed this one. But I'll summarize my thoughts anyway. Conversion therapy is cruel, sexually invasive, and ineffective. Any evidence as to its effectiveness is questionable. Granted, proving its effectiveness beyond a doubt would likely require a means of reading minds. I don't deny that fantasies can be modified over time as one grows and learns, but attempting to change them through self-guilt or from conversion therapy, especially when the motivation for changing them is based on faulty information, isn't going to work. The report questions the efficacy and the necessity of conversion therapy, and instead suggests that issues regarding sexual offenders be solved closer to the root. It says sexual fantasies are ubiquitous, that paraphiles, by their modern definition, are normal and everywhere, and that the mere presence of a sexual fantasy is no indication that someone is a potential predator. The report does say that concern is warranted if sexual fantasies about rape or children are preferred over all other fantasies, and take on a compulsive or exclusive character with regards to non-offenders. It says this without elaboration or what concern means here, and also without evidence and against what else it says throughout. Probably to be like, oh, we're totally not pro-pedo or some shit. It also says there's also reason for concern if they occur in people who display risk factors for sexual abuse, when those risk factors themselves are what warrant concern, I say. At that point, the fantasy only serves to contextualize their choice of target. Hence the many people who commit CSA without possessing minor attraction. Minors are easy and accessible targets for sexual gratification to them. The next one is the one by Malamuth, Addison, and Koss. Pornography and sexual aggression. Are there reliable effects and can we understand them? I really like this paper. It makes the point that people often fail to account for surrounding context and other variables when trying to determine whether or not porn use is harmful. So, it talks about other factors like hostile masculinity, belief in rape myths, home background abuse, sex education, all that jazz. It mentioned that in much of this type of research, it is only these types of men who show evidence of significant negative effects, which it further demonstrates through its own methodology by sampling thousands of college men and determining that there was a significant correlation only between consumption of violent porn and sexual aggression among the high-risk men, with far lower levels of correlation occurring among lower-risk groups. They admitted that they couldn't determine which was the cause and which was the effect, and they realized the possible influence of American culture upon its men, so they looked to similar research using Denmark and saw that there was no evidence of any such correlation. Turns out, Denmark is much better about sex, sex ed, and trust between people than the US is, though that's an extremely low bar. I find it highly amusing that the "it's just a story's" use of empirical evidence is an attempt to criticize Cook for interpreting the data in Malamuth, Addison, and Koss's paper as evidence that the findings on the relationship between porn use and aggression are inconclusive. It tries to counter by doing things like pointing to the laboratory study that the paper cited that compared behavior with exposure to nudity, non-violent porn, and violent porn, when the paper's whole point was that studies like this, and even their own attempts, can't grasp the full picture and leave out critical variables. Granted, it's just a story's point is that porn or fantasy can be used to cultivate desire, but even that statement requires looking at the relationship between the user, the content, and the world around them, as Malamuth, Addison, and Koss point out. I want to make something very clear here if I somehow haven't already. I'm not saying porn can never, ever be harmful under any circumstance. That's a straw man, and I don't think anyone argues that. Knives and paper can be harmful under the right circumstances. I'm saying that porn isn't harmful on its own, divorced from the surrounding context. Though one could make that claim about anything, so I'll be a bit more specific. I think it's much more feasible, practical, and beneficial to society if we were to, instead of trying to censor what is able to exist even in the realms of one's own fantasies. Trust me, I've spent long periods of time without porn before. My brain was capable of coming up with far more fucked up stuff on its own before I even knew what porn was. Instead of trying to censor that, we should combat what can potentially make it harmful. Combat toxic masculinity, poor sex ed, the industry, capitalism, rape myths, and don't try to tell me it's good to do both at once, because by going after millions of innocent people who happen to possess a fetish or power of attraction, you waste your energy you could spend for the real perpetrators on those who have done no wrong and are often victims themselves. Her next source is Ethics and Fictive Imagining by Brandon Cook, the same Cook that wrote on the ethical distinction between art and pornography. That It's Just a Story article was largely written as a response to those two papers, in fact. It argues that there's nothing wrong with fictively imagining anything, save for the export of unethical values or beliefs. It argues that if one were to fictively imagine a rape scenario with women, that would have no bearing on what the individual believes about women as a whole. I would speculate that they possibly find women attractive and may have a rape fetish. It's just the story demands analysis of more context regarding the user or person imagining, holding them accountable if they use the fantasy to cultivate an immoral desire. And I'd argue that's more a problem with the user and the beliefs instilled and permitted by the world around them. Though, two things can be bad at once. I will call out racism and such in fiction, while advocating for the spread of factual beliefs against bigotry, thus better equipping people to not be negatively influenced by such content. I'm not going to read Mein Kampf and become a Nazi, and I doubt Paige would either. Paige argues that consuming Kodocon can only be done out of an immoral desire or to cultivate one. I've, well, spent quite a lot of time and effort arguing the contrary so far. The next source is one she mentioned before, Gott's Ethical Criticism of Art. This was one of two sources she referenced as making a good case against art censorship, while she attempted to argue that Kodocon was a justified exception. It talks about how a work's quality can be influenced by its ability or willingness to promote ethical values, though it also acknowledges that unethical work can be well crafted and ethical work can be boring. There's naturally going to be subjectivity with regards to evaluating art quality, which also goes into the work's relationship with different consumers of different backgrounds, how well it's able to sell its values, cases where the viewers interpret the work totally differently, especially over time. Evaluation of art quality is subjective, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't put together frameworks or guidelines. It also doesn't mean we must adhere to them. This sounds like its own subject, but I think this paper's got its own problems. Those consuming a work of fiction, knowing it's a work of fiction, don't need to have their character put into question if they enjoy or are amused by cruelty in the work, at least not without more context than what the paper gives. I wouldn't judge someone if they laughed instead of cried at the ending of... Fuck, that's a spoiler. Anyway, whatever works for us. We know we're consuming fiction. Again, Kodocon is largely consumed by people who know it's unethical in real life. Her next source is a paper titled The Association Between Exposure to Violent Pornography and Teen Dating Violence in Grade 10 High School Students. As the title implies, it was an attempt to find correlations between exposure to violent porn and threats, physical violence, or sexual violence among American 10th graders. Kids totally deprived of good sex ed, drenched in American culture, who are thus more likely to learn from porn and breach boundaries. 15 years old on average. What a recipe for disaster. It says at one point that individuals who force their dating partners to watch violent pornography may possess a particular propensity for aggression. Gee, you think so? That's sexual harassment! Anyway, they accounted for numerous other variables here, like marijuana use, suspension history, gender equitable attitudes, acceptance of rape myths, and alcohol use. For physical violence, girls were marginally more likely to be perpetrators if they consumed violent porn, while boys were actually more likely to be victims of such if they were exposed to it. The variable that significantly determined them perpetrating it was how much or little they held gender equitable attitudes. Those with more equitable attitudes were less likely to commit physical violence. Makes perfect sense. For sexual violence, none of the variables influenced whether or not girls would perpetrate it, while exposure to violent porn was marginally correlated to them falling victim to it. For boys, exposure to violent porn and weed were correlated with them perpetrating and falling victim to sexual violence. Again, in that kind of environment and without good sex ed, this makes perfect sense. For threats, exposure to violent porn was one of many significant variables for girls perpetrating them, but not falling victim to them. Violent porn seemed to have no bearing on whether boys made threats or were threatened. The paper associated acceptance of rape myths and less gender-equitable attitudes with violence after controlling for exposure to porn, which makes sense to me. With the exception of making them more likely to make threats, exposure to violent porn seemingly had no effect on girls. However appealing they found it, they would probably be less incentivized to emulate what they see in it. Women often, but not always, play the victim in that kind of porn, and my country isn't good at creating an environment that gives rise to safe, trustworthy men. The study also didn't account for whether or not the exposure was intentional. The study called for better implementations of sex ed, being educated and being taught critical thinking skills about how porn differs from reality, and teaching better relationship skills. With the internet being more widespread and accessible, censorship becomes less and less feasible. The study also admitted it couldn't determine a causal link between exposure to porn and violent behavior. Again, in the absence of education better enabling us to handle this kind of content, I don't doubt it. The Netherlands and Denmark, as mentioned earlier, have us beat in this regard. The next source is one page mentioned earlier, Ponder Sprocket's video. Your art offends my sensibilities, stop it. This was a pretty neat video. I learned about some interesting art experiments through it. Brooke cautioned against allowing one's personal life experiences to influence them into calling for the erasure of art they don't like, which Paige is guilty of, as I'll show later.
Now, some people have gotten it into their heads not only that 1, artwork that triggers that negative emotional response puts the artist at blame, and that 2, artwork that triggers them personally should not be permitted. But, realistically, where's the cutoff point for that?
Brooke also touches upon another phenomenon, the ever-growing and increasingly accessible nature of the internet, combined with the increasing ease in which people are able to create art and relate to it and others' art.
Plus, I'm sorry, but there's always going to be some manner of weird, gory, edgy, controversial content that you don't like. As the internet expands further and further, that amount of content you dislike is really only just going to increase. Hey, but so will the content that you do like, so bonus, I guess.
I bring this up because it ties into people realizing they have patterns of attraction geared towards Kodocon and perhaps other kinks, of giving them solidarity that they're not the only ones. Combined with more and more information becoming accessible with regards to paraphilia and kinks, and more people from all over the world are creating and consuming Kodocon and being more open about it, particularly on social media.
So why everyone is getting into such a tizzy about it now, I can't fathom.
The increase in calls for censorship alongside other harmful behavior as a response to this kind of art Brooke mentioned is, I believe, at least in part, a reaction to this phenomenon. It's the wisdom of disgust, and many people would rather go to extreme measures to target individuals with the wrong kinks than to accept that they're commonplace, inherently harmless, and cannot be willed out of existence. The next one is a paper, From Fantasy to Reality, the link between viewing child pornography and molesting children. It goes into the correlation between CSAM consumption and committing CSA. Beyond consuming CSAM. This correlation doesn't surprise me. By consuming CSAM, one is already breaching boundaries, so of course they'd be willing to directly assault a child. It does say one interesting thing. Sadly, child molesters tend to target children who are neglected or come from dysfunctional homes. For these children, the child molester offers an alternative relationship that makes their child feel special and loved. As a result, children who are abused frequently exhibit fierce loyalty to their abusers. This is something I talk quite a bit about in this video here. There's a problem with this paper though. The study showing the highest correlation between direct offenders and CSAM consumers is the Federal Bureau of Prisons 2000 study, which has a host of problems. For example, it grouped CSAM offenders with those traveling to commit a contact offense to a minor they met on the internet. The study also used averages rather than means, meaning one individual who committed 202 contact offenses, for example, skewed the data. There was also a failure to differentiate between the ages of the contact offense victims. Of course, there's also the selection effect. The group being assessed here are contact offenders, and thus would not necessarily exhibit the thoughts and behavior of non-contact CSAM consumers. There's a paper which goes over the massive amount of problems with this study, and the one the Bureau made in 2009, as well as many other abuses of law and misuses of statistics. I highly recommend it. Next is the Wikipedia article, Relationship between Child Pornography and Child Sexual Abuse. This is a bit of an interesting one. It goes over two conflicting viewpoints. Whether consuming CSAM increases the likelihood of someone committing more direct CSA, or whether it reduces it. It mentions a third viewpoint suggesting that there's either no correlation or insufficient data. Consuming CSAM is damaging and reprehensible no matter how much it hypothetically reduces CSA, I say. But let's take a look. For the first viewpoint, it cites the From Fantasy to Reality paper we just discussed, as well as another study talking about the correlation between American CSA perpetrators reoffending and their consumption of porn. There was also a boner detector test. Turns out those who possess CSAM tend to be attracted to CSAM. I already went over the hypothetical every CSA perpetrator is a pedophile in this video. There is suspected to be a large and diverse group of CSAM consumers outside those who committed more direct CSA. There are also studies differentiating those who don't have a certain amount of material contact offending, and those who do possess a certain amount not doing it. The latter group also being less likely to produce or trade it. Of course, there was criticism at these studies for failing to establish causation, and additional studies, like in Switzerland and Canada, showed much lower rates of contact offenses among those who consume CSAM. For the second viewpoint, it first says that legalization of porn in general in many places causes sex crimes to either stabilize or decrease, and then says that with the accessibility of CSAM came the fall of CSA, as it states happened in Denmark and Japan. Again, that's if you don't rightfully consider the creation, distribution, and viewing of such material CSA in of itself, which is why it's suggested that simulated CSAM be used instead, perhaps like Kodocon if one considers it such, though calling Kodocon CP or CSAM is highly offensive to many abuse survivors. As I said in this video, if being exposed to Kodocon stops someone from offending, though that's a good thing, it's like if being exposed to it caused someone to offend. It's indicative of a deeper issue. Kodocon should not be an influencing factor at all. Also, even if real CSAM was proven to reduce contact CSA, that doesn't justify its existence. Like I said, not only is that indicative of a deeper issue on the part of the consumer, but CSAM requires CSA to make, and the child's boundaries are being breached by sharing and consuming it. Those are absolutely vital differences between CSAM and Kodocon, but I've made that clear already. The next source is another paper, Just Looking, Tantalization, Lolicon, and Virtual Girls. This paper talks specifically about Lolicon stuff and its history in Japan. It conflates it with CSAM and talks about how the UN moans about Japan's lax attitudes towards that kind of art. Yeah. It talks about how there's a sizable, yet still in the minority, correlation among consumers of CSAM and perpetrators of more direct CSA. I've been over this. Those consuming CSAM demonstrate a willingness to breach boundaries already. Which reminds me, this paper asks 3 questions. First, if I knew my daughter's soccer coach read, collected, and watched lolicon anime about young girls in sexual situations, would I allow him to be alone with my child? Depends on what my daughter and I knew or felt about him. Whether or not he's a Kodocon would have no bearing on how I felt about him. For all I know, my daughter could be a Kodocon. It then asks, what about Japanese girls who have grown up in a culture where 1 in 10 adult men admit to having viewed child pornography? Depends on what you mean by child pornography. I've made my case that it's a separate problem entirely. Finally, it asks, what about men who look at erotic images of young girls on their phones or flip through lolicon anime on the subway or in restaurants full of children and teens? Well, then they're carelessly breaching boundaries and showing potentially triggering content in public. It'd be the same if they were looking at tamer hentai in a place like that. The paper talks about groomers using Kodocon to groom children. I make the same argument. Tamer hentai could serve the same purpose. Grooming an impressionable child devoid of progressive sex ed or a good family doesn't take much. The paper says that when an adult enters into a child's realm with the purpose of exerting their will, authority, or influence with the intent of exploitation, we should be vigilant and clear about legislation that seeks to protect. I agree with that sentence and say that Kodocon has about as much to do with it as candy does. I take it back, candy has caused far more harm to children than Kodocon has. It also discusses a possible phenomenon of men consuming lolicon as a reaction to gains in women's rights, channeling desires for submissive girls whom they have power over. I believe there may be people who consume lolicon for that purpose. I've been told before that shotacons tend to be leftists more frequently. But it doesn't factor in people who simply find lolicon attractive the same way many people just find boobs attractive. People from countries all over the world, possessing every single sexual orientation and gender across the board and beyond it. Suffering from self-loathing and outside abuse as people try to convince them that because of what they're attracted to, they must be potential predators. Spoken often by those who actually are predators. Like the UN. Alright, her last source on this list is virtual child pornography, human trafficking, and Japanese law, pop culture, harm, and legal restraints. Oh, I like this one. It makes many of the points I've made. Of course, it cites Malamuth. I've been seeing him around a lot lately. It discusses Kodocon's relevancy to human trafficking and other crime, whether or not such things are sufficient grounds for banning it. Again, it talks about the UN's complaints against Japan with regards to Kodocon. You know the drill. It talks about how Kodocon can cause people to commit CSA, which is indicative of deeper issues, and how Kodocon can be used as a grooming tool, much like anything else. In fact, the paper calls attention to how minor attraction isn't required to commit CSA. There was a sample of 181 CSA perpetrators, and only 17% of that group used porn during their crimes, and only 55% of that subgroup used porn to groom, mostly using hetero-adult porn. 13% used the porn for themselves for stimulation prior to committing CSA. In a different study of CSA perpetrators, 21% of 91 people used it to decrease their inhibitions, so they were planning to commit CSA anyway. The paper goes on. Accordingly, although a considerable minority of sex offenders against children report to have used some kind of pornographic material to influence their criminal behavior, the type of pornography is not necessarily or exclusively child pornography, as it may also include adult pornography. Another study looked at Swiss people busted for CSAM. Only one had a relevant criminal record, possibly meaning only one of those had committed more direct CSA. I bring this up not to defend CSAM, but to question porn's potential for harm, and to see how it interacts with other countries and cultures, if something far worse like CSAM apparently isn't enough to cause people to consistently commit more direct CSA. It then says pornography, including violent and virtual, can be framed as a potential for harm. That is, in certain cases and circumstances, it might entice people into committing child abuse or be used in the grooming process. However, the potential for harm is not the same as harm. Person A can punch Person B because A likes to randomly fight with people, has a clenched fist, and is a black belt in martial arts. These facts, however, do not alone justify criminally prosecuting A for the possibility of one day punching B. Moreover, the fact that people who practice martial arts might eventually fight and harm people on the streets cannot justify by itself a criminal legislation prohibiting martial arts altogether. I fully agree with this. I actually empathize with it. I possess a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and I like fighting people. But if I were to randomly beat someone up, my problem in this scenario wouldn't be my martial arts training or my enjoyment for fighting, but my lack of respect for boundaries. It continues. The grooming argument as it stands is simply too vague. Who is potentially harmed? Any children who happens to live in a specific location? Who is committing the wrongdoing? Anyone who buys or looks at lolicon material? How to clearly establish a connection between the harmed and the one harming? In other words, how to clearly, beyond a reasonable doubt, prove that buying, producing, selling, or looking at lolicon would indeed cause harm to a determinate number of children in a specific jurisdiction. Yes, indeed, just looking. I'll reiterate, it's entirely possible to simply imagine the stuff independently of any paper or computer. It goes on. As previously mentioned, there is evidence that some child abusers are pedophiles. You know, just like how some say male-on-male rapists are homosexual or bisexual, but criminalizing homosexual or bisexual attractions would be asinine. And within that group, a minority use child pornography or any pornography at all to groom children. The call for prohibition based on grooming is then grounded on a statistical probability that certain people who have lolicon materials might use it to groom children. This view might not by itself support the argument for an overall criminalization of virtual child pornography. If that is the case, that is, if the prohibition of lolicon is grounded on the possibility that adults might show it to children, the criminalization should then not be the production, sale, possession, or purchase of virtual child pornography, but rather to show it to people under a specific age, or to show people regardless of age but against their will. Well, yes, showing someone porn against their will is sexual harassment. I wonder why Paige cited this article. It makes several of the points I intend to make later, and she doesn't sufficiently counter them, at least to me. The paper does offer an opposing view, one professed by Catherine McKinnon, who states that porn, real porn, is trafficking because it creates demand for women and children to be supplied for sexual use to make it, many of whom are trafficked to fill that demand. Huh? So men aren't trafficked? She's absolutely right that trafficking is a massive problem in the porn industry, but that's a problem with a massive money-hungry industry. Saying you can't be pro-porn and anti-porn industry is like saying you can't be pro-gun and anti-United States. Besides, forgive me if I have a difficult time trusting McKinnon. The paper goes on to say that the research on the detrimental effects of porn are inconclusive at best. Consuming it, yeah, but the way the industry creates it is very much detrimental. There was a young victim of it, Smeeb Smob, who got out of it only for them to be doxxed by aunties for being a pro shipper and for them to have their home broken into by their trafficker. They avoided capture but were raped. I hope they're doing alright. So, two things can be bad at once, and what makes the porn industry bad has nothing to do with Kodocon. That material is mainly created without any exploitation whatsoever. Which reminds me, there's a few instances where this paper mentions pornography that's indistinguishable from a real child. Which, yes, that would be bad. It'd be bad if the porn was even based on a real child. Kodocon usually isn't. So that's the last of our sources, many of which have supported my argument. They utterly failed to convince me that Kodocon was bad and should be banned. The last two touched upon Japanese culture and the country's CSA problems, which, let's have a closer look at that. As this article points out, the rise of reported child abuse cases is a good thing. It's indicative of a heightened awareness of what child abuse is. Places like the UK and US report a much higher number of cases, and those numbers are probably underreported too. I'm not saying Japan doesn't have problems, capitalism problems, patriarchal problems. Not Kodocon problems exclusive to Japan, though it does have one. Genitalia and hentai must be censored. So the companies and people's ability to produce quality porn is actually hampered compared to those from many other places in the world doing it. So, after having gone through all her sources, Duchess Celestia has 2 more sections left. If her arguments and sources have thus far been insufficient, will what she have to say going forward be any more convincing? Get ready. Things are about to get personal as we return to her video.
And that brings us, finally, to the biggest question. Does lolicon harm real children, even if its creation does not? Well, so far we've already discussed some of the biggest ways. There is documented and very readily available proof that cultivating pedophilic desires is not only immoral, but it can empirically and objectively lead to an increased risk of people who consume lolicon content pursuing those desires in real life. That in and of itself is harmful to real children.
Okay, what are you referring to? Which of your sources? I've been over every single one of them. At worst, it's the knives argument, that Kodocon could potentially be used as a grooming weapon or as a means of causing someone to emulate the content, which are both indicative of different problems not inherent to Kodocon, as I've mentioned ad nauseum, and the rate of which such incidents happen is both difficult to determine and can be curbed by solving the aforementioned problems, which are much easier and more beneficial to society to solve than to stop people from trying to get off the Kodocon.
But it's easy to hear that from a study or an article, or see it represented through statistics and evaluation. It's harder to dismiss from actual sources. And that brings me to something that's harder for me to talk about, that I never wanted to talk about in the first place, but apparently I have to. And that's my groomer. In a very old story time with embarrassingly bad audio and art, linked in the card above, I shared my experience with a 24-year-old man who manipulated me into a romantic and sexual relationship, starting when I was 13 and ending when I was 14. I described the experience in a flippant and borderline sarcastic way as a method of coping. But the bottom line is that it was traumatizing and this man groomed and abused me. More relevantly, he justified doing so by citing lolicon. He would send me manga and doujinshi depicting very, very underage girls with grown men and used it to convince me that our relationship, if I can even call it that, was okay. Just because some people go their whole lives enjoying lolicon without ever abusing a real child does not negate the fact that lolicon can, objectively and quantifiably, influence real human beings to abuse children, and it very frequently does. I am walking proof that it does. When I say that lolicon normalizes and justifies the sexualization of real minors, I am not talking out of my ass. I am speaking from the perspective of someone whose groomer, who was actively sexualizing me, aggressively and persistently when I was very much a minor, and because I was a minor, he literally told me that that type of media reassured him that his desires were normal. He used that media to justify desires that he may not otherwise have ever acted on.
I doubt you'll believe me, but I'm sorry that happened to you. No one should have to go through that to fall victim to any kind of sexual abuse, including conversion therapy. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in my country, the sex ed we have here is so abysmal that anything, not just Kodocon, can be used as a grooming tool. Hell, you don't even need tools to groom someone who doesn't know exactly what you're doing. As you pointed out, the groomer themselves doesn't need to know exactly what they're doing. I learned all this the hard way. Those who inflicted CSA on me, they were consistently overweight people. Should I then foster a hatred for overweight people based on those incidents? No, that would be asinine. But I will ask you another question. What say you to the many, many people who have been groomed and assaulted by vocal antis, including anti-Kodocons? You have the gall to then say,
But my personal experience probably won't even be enough for many of you, so let's get into the interview portion.
you say that, and here I am doubting very much that the massive amounts of incidents against Kodocons and adjacent groups that occur even as I script this video, orders of magnitude more than your one incident, are enough to convince you that, by your logic, you, Duchess Celestia, are a potential abuser. I won't say that, because I won't use your logic, but with the evidence presented, I have much more reason to believe that vocal antis are potential abusers than Kodocons are. So at the very least, I can say that you belong to a more dangerous group. You use your harrowing, yet singular, anecdote to back up the claim that Kodocon very frequently influences someone to abuse. This is very similar to a certain other phenomenon. This is part of why we compare the discussion to the one involving violent games, because without the knowledge of what one is doing, playing violent games can also lead to tragedy. This is why I advocate for good sex ed. That's why I constantly praise how it's done in the Netherlands and the efforts of their young Democrats. Do you realize how many Kodocons are CSA survivors? As stated in this page from the blog I discussed earlier, in the stages of grooming, porn is shown after the groomer has already gained the trust of the victim. Thus, the damage is done. Good sex ed equips children to recognize grooming attempts. It also prevents them from being influenced by porn. If porn convinced your groomer that being attracted to minors is okay, that's not a problem. If it convinced him that breaching boundaries and attempting to abuse you and pursue a relationship with a minor was okay, that's no excuse for him. He should have known better, and he should have been taught better. If he was, then it was an act of malice, and thus we're back to the knife argument. Now for the last portion. Paige talks to an anonymous mental health professional here. The comments debate on whether or not they're real, but I think they are, because this discussion is extremely inflammatory, and therapists would have damn good reasons to remain anonymous, like the many therapists who condone Kodocon online are. So, let's hear it.
I reached out to a mental health professional who has requested to remain anonymous, because I wanted to cover all of my bases with these takes and not just rely on existing articles. Instead, I wanted a qualified professional's take on this very specific instance, and I'm incredibly grateful to them for providing it. This individual has almost 30 years of experience as a therapist, a master's degree in psychology, and is a certified social worker.
So, you know who else was an experienced therapist and a certified social worker? The therapist who tried to put me through ABA therapy. Call me paranoid, but I fear boomer therapists may have a tendency to rely on outdated psychology. I don't doubt there might be means of mitigating that, but I don't know how enforced they are, so forgive me if I'm not too impressed by this info alone. Where did the degree come from? What's the process like where they are? I want to refer you to this video if you want my full take on this issue. Now, onto the interview.
They have worked with both offenders and victims, and they have studied both extensively. They were given the same description of lolicon and the nuances of it that was given at the beginning of this video, and they were given no information as to my own personal stance to preserve objectivity and an unbiased perspective. Our interview is as follows, with distortion for anonymity's sake. Is there any reason that an individual would enjoy media depicting an underage fictional character in a sexual situation that does not reflect pedophilic inclinations?
From an ethical and moral position, as well as from a child development, psychological, and law enforcement perspective, I would suggest that it would be deemed pedophilic to be viewing sexualized art of underage children, perhaps even to be creating it if it is posted somewhere for all to see. It is a very slippery slope and a very concerning one. As a therapist who has been working with children and youth for over 28 years, I've been witness to the damage that's been done to children who have been exposed to sexualized art, as well as those who have been sexually abused. It would perpetrate an already existing epidemic. Those keen to view fictional art eroticizing children is a big red flag.
It would not necessarily be pedophilic, I went over that earlier. It would not be bad if it was, I went over that earlier. Exposing children to sexualized art and sexually abusing them are not a Kodocon problem. Anti-Kodocons tend to be guilty of that. Against their will, Kodocons and pro-shippers are shown real gore in CSAM. Antis perpetuate rape culture. When they're not sexually abusing people, including children themselves, they advocate for conversion therapy, legally sanctioned sexual abuse. Or our deaths.
Would you consider an individual who enjoys art of fictional underage characters depicted sexually to be a pedophile?
Pedophile is a strong term with a clear definition: a person sexually attracted to children. My query is, what is the individual gleaning from sexualized art of children specifically? I am hard-pressed to understand. If they are not sexually attracted to children, why would they not instead enjoy something similar of adults? Why children? Why is it specifically about children expressed sexually in art that is appealing? I think the answer is right there. I would posit that it is the children specifically that draws them into the enjoyment. Thus, it begs one to question, are they then a pedophile?
Maybe, maybe not. But as I said, Kodocon is very visually distinct from real children and from anime adults. Enjoying Kodocon doesn't mean you're attracted to real children, just as how many real pedophiles aren't attracted to Kodocon. It's too different. Why are we attracted to Kodocon? I dunno. Why are people attracted to women? It's not entirely rational, and quite frankly, your wisdom of disgust doesn't give you the right to be invasive and try to determine what we're attracted to, or not, or why. It reminds me of cis people questioning us trans people. You don't get to determine what we are, and we don't owe you an explanation. I don't give a shit how harmful you think we are, or how much you try to be a conservative and try to tie us to CSA.
Do you believe that the creation and circulation of this art does measurable harm to actual children, even if the characters depicted are fictional and not real children themselves?
I do. It perpetuates the eroticization of children and also has a strong possibility of causing more trauma and damage to children who have been sexually abused or assaulted, in addition to the possibility of putting other children at risk. It would give children the message that they are not valued, not safe, and are objects to be used sexually rather than little humans who have the basic and essential right to be safe and secure in this world and to maintain their innocence. So yes, immeasurable harm. It also has the potential to re-traumatize adults who have been sexually abused as children and had to overcome those assaults against them.
Do you realize how much damage you cause to many children by implying that their patterns of attraction are evil or dangerous? By this logic, sexualizing any fictional woman or man in hentai gives the message that those entire genders hold no value to the consumer or artist. If an adult is re-traumatized by viewing Kodocon, more context is required before assigning blame. Like, either the Kodocon is in a public place where it shouldn't be, the artist didn't tag it, or that the adult in question ignored the tags. Also, again, many Kodocon consumers and artists are CSA survivors. Speaking of which...
If the person creating sexualized art of fictional children is a victim of CSA themselves, do you believe that them enjoying and creating this media is a valid coping mechanism?
Art for therapy purposes can have significant value for healing. It's circulating that art that is the concern. For those healing from childhood sexual abuse through art, the tendency of the individual is not to have that made public and shown to the world. It is typically a very private process for them to work out, and is loaded with emotions, thoughts, and struggles that are too broad to mention here. It is a private process if used in this way, and those that have experienced childhood abuse would understand how making this public and accessible to anyone would be damaging not only to them, but to all children and adults with that history in multiple catastrophic ways. Or I would hope that they would understand. If that is not the case, I would suggest that their healing and understanding of what happened to them is not fully integrated.
There's a false dichotomy here. Kodocon may not be private, but it's also not spread all over the place. I'm not going to go to YouTube and find it. I don't find it unless I actively look for it. Sharing art and experiences is healing as well. Solidarity is bred by seeing other people's imaginations and getting reassurance that you're not alone in your attractions, your kinks. Art potentially being triggering is insufficient cause for its total erasure.
If the person creating sexualized art of fictional characters is not a victim of CSA themselves, do you believe that there is any justifiable reason for them to enjoy and create this media?
I struggle to find a way to justify this art otherwise. I would be concerned and would wonder what is motivating that individual. I'm looking at this as a therapist and not through the lens of an artist. It, again, becomes a very significant moral, ethical, and legal issue in my mind. The question keeps coming up: why children?
Why boobs? Why dicks? Why men? Why women? Why find anything attractive? Again, these aren't even real children. The reason why looking at CSAM is bad, whether you find real children attractive or not, is because the creation of that media involves child abuse. With Kodocon, that's not a factor. Wisdom of disgust bullshit. Again, assuming, against the evidence present in Page's own sources, that the parent of attraction is sufficient evidence to assume that one's a danger.
Do you believe that the sexualization of fictional children in art could lead to the normalization and acceptance of actual children in reality?
Yes. It absolutely perpetrates an already tragic existing problem, gives others permission to do so, normalizes it, and completely devalues the innocence and safety of children, putting them at increased risk. It can also be very re-traumatizing for children who have been victimized. The risk is tremendous for normalization and acceptance of this horrific assault on children.
Again, you're normalizing a horrific assault on children already, by implying that their patterns of attraction make them monsters or invalid. There's a rape problem, yes, but it's more likely to come from people without the pattern, from aunties themselves. Also, again, can't you see how the logic you and the therapist use imply that by making or enjoying drawn porn of fictional women or men, you devalue their safety? What kind of sense does that make?
Do you believe that this type of art should be allowed to exist on the internet?
100% no, it should not. The internet is now where predators lurk the most, and is used to groom children. Furthermore, children are learning younger and younger how to access the internet, and are very savvy at finding all sorts of things. The potential damage to them coming across this type of media is tremendous. We all have a responsibility in our society, regardless of our passions, freedom of speech and expression, etc., to keep our children safe.
I wish this therapist came with citations. If Paige believes that their status as a therapist alone provides enough weight to what they say, then I wonder what she thinks about therapists who approve of Kodocon. Will she listen to their reasons? First, most cases of CSA come from acquaintances, family, not strangers. Yes, you can groom someone over the internet. Should we ban the internet? Like we should ban Kodocon because it can be used as a grooming tool? I've made my case as to how impractical and unnecessary the latter would be. Banning the former would be even more of a neat trick. Yes, kids are accessing the internet at younger ages and becoming savvier. That's a good thing that would also be impractical to reverse, particularly as technology advances and becomes more accessible. What should be done is teaching them internet safety, teaching them good sex ed, equipping them against groomers, and teaching them about the patterns of attraction so that we can, indeed, keep our children safe. It's also the job of the adults to tag their content.
Many justify the enjoyment of this content as paraphilia. Do you agree with this?
One of the key elements in the term paraphilia is that it pertains to mature, consenting partners. Children are not mature, and they are not consenting. Additionally, they are considered to be too young to consent if given the option. Paraphilia is also considered an intense and persistent sexual interest. Intense and persistent sexual interest clearly shows it is not just for the enjoyment of art. It is the sexual pleasure they receive from art of sexualized children. I think that says it all.
Yes, the art of sexualized fictional children that look very distinct from real children. You get the idea. Also, where did the therapists get the notion that paraphilias pertain to mature, consenting partners? I mean, for fuck's sake, do you know how many paraphilias pertain to objects? Again, we know children can't consent to adults. Having a paraphilia towards something isn't going to disarm us of basic fucking ethics. You know, whether Kodocons are actually attracted to real children or not.
Thank you again to this individual for their educated insight, as I feel that this video would not have been thorough or complete without the input of a professional on this specific circumstance. I sincerely hope that this video was able to provide an adequate, thorough, and detailed follow-up to my initial video, as I do recognize that I did gloss over the topic of Kodocon despite having the resources not to. I will not make that mistake again in the future. I understand that many potential viewers may disagree, but I truly believe that I have done the utmost research into this topic, and I don't believe that there is anything any of them can present at this point that would change my view of Kodocon. I also believe that anyone who supports the sexualization of children in media of any kind, specifically because those characters are children and not despite the fact that they're children, I don't believe they're someone I want to have a conversation with. I'm not saying that people sexualizing underage characters despite the fact that their children are fine, but they're not who I'm referring to in this video, although I may revisit that specific subgroup in the future. Thank you for watching, and I hope the video was adequately informative. I'll be back next week with some exciting contests, sponsors, updates, and announcements, in addition to some less heavy content, so I'll see you guys then.
Your video was thorough. It was detailed. It was not adequate. Let me show you some of my sources. I gave you a sample earlier with Casey Lytle. How about a therapist, April Kilduff? She says, it's common for people to engage in fantasies involving taboo subjects like incest or rape. However, indulging in these thoughts does not equate to an intention to ever act upon them, or even desire them in real life. They also say, if you're worried about what it might mean that you enjoy lolicon, your fears are most closely related to a particular OCD subtype called POCD. POCD involves persistent, distressing, and intrusive obsessions related to pedophilic themes. Importantly, people with POCD are not actual pedophiles. These thoughts, feelings, urges, or images are ego-dystonic, meaning they oppose one's values, intentions, and identity. I covered what I think about POCD in this video, but to sum up, it would be more accurately called something like CAOCD or CSAOCD, the fear being that one is a potential predator, which is distinct from a pedophile. People need to learn that being attracted to kids is in of itself extremely common and not indicative that one is a potential predator. But April goes on to correctly recommend exposure therapy for dealing with OCD and intrusive thoughts. This includes fears about Kodocon. Elise Christensen, chief physician and head of the Danish sexology clinic at Rigshospitalet, I'm sorry if I mispronounced anything, led a report saying that there is no scientific evidence to say that Kodocon is harmful. Such was the conclusion of the clinic to the best of their knowledge, they said. They have the burden of proving a negative. Such a burden also fell on experienced forensic criminologist Dr. William Thompson, who, in his paper, Child Pornography, Pedophilia, and Contact Offending, the Empirical Research, concludes that there is no scientific basis for the prohibition of private possession of Kodocon, calling out several double standards in the process. Of course, the UK and US governments being draconian and incompetent shouldn't be news to anyone. I mentioned this paper earlier. It was the one that critiqued the Prison Bureau study. And out of the many scientific papers I've read for this video, this one may be my favorite of the bunch because it goes over many errors committed in attempting to conflate contact offenders with CSAM consumers. Both are bad, mind you, and I don't believe this paper pretends otherwise. But if correlation between the two is so weak, then the already incredibly shaky argument equating Kodocon with CSAM, and thus saying that it causes CSA, loses even more ground. I don't think this paper's perfect. I have issues with its use of the term psychopathology, for example. Of course, it's easier to profile those who are mentally ill and have less impulse control as potential criminals when neurotypical people commit CSA in more insidious, ubiquitous ways that are either entirely legal or overlooked by a police force comprised of domestic abusers, but that's a different topic. Those who possess cluster B personality disorders are often misunderstood and generalized. But it stands to reason that those who disregard people's boundaries, whether they possess such a disorder or not, are the ones more likely to commit CSA. Another interesting thing about this paper is that it criticizes Drs. Seto, Cantor, and Blanchard's phallometric tests. You know, the boner detectors. Now, Seto and Blanchard's work is referenced in these statistics I often show you about what percentage of CSA offenders are MAPS, but the fact is, at least a couple of them may be overestimations because of their usage of data from boner detectors and how unreliable they are, and because of how unreliable Seto and Blanchard's data is. This paper is so interesting to me, I might make my own video about it. Maybe. I'm honestly suffering decision paralysis here because we have so many sources on hand. Here's the page I'm referencing, along with some massive Google Drive folders chock full of sources. It also has a section dedicated to the horrific harassment people have suffered at the hands of aunties. A lot of these have to do with debunking the more general belief that porn causes someone to offend. Oh look, here's another therapist. If you are suffering decision paralysis as I am, thankfully Starbar, the one behind this page, wrote a document summarizing a lot of research. I highly recommend reading it. On one hand, I fear aunties are too steeped in the wisdom of repugnance to realize they're wrong no matter how much evidence is thrown at them. Perhaps they fear realizing all the harm they've done was for a bad cause. On the other hand, ex-aunties like myself must come from somewhere. So I ask of you, Duchess Celestia, what about our victim experiences? Our therapists? Our research? You spoke earlier about the value of open debate and discussion, how it broadened and reinforced your worldview, much how engaging with your video broadened and reinforced mine. Yet you believe that your conclusion has more grounds than it actually does, and won't have a conversation with us. I'd like to ask you another question. What would you do if you have a child or nibbling and they turned out to be a Kodocon? or a map, what then? I know you've fallen victim to homophobia in the past. It's a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that you're capable of spouting very similar beliefs to your oppressors. Beliefs sustained by very similar slander. It was a bitter pill for us to swallow to see that victims of such oppression could target us, emulating their oppressors in the process. But as the slander is combated and more of us learn the truth, there's going to be more paraphiles and Kodocons. And you say you wouldn't want to have a conversation with us? Well, depending on how many people you talk to, there's a good chance you speak to us already without realizing it. I ask, with the evidence I provided in this video and others, from a moral and a pragmatic standpoint, that you please accept our existence. Now, you oppose censorship except for Kodocon. The topic of censorship has always been a vague one to me, and because of that, you could argue that I'm pro-censorship in some ways. I believe in banning Nazi imagery and rhetoric from public spaces, for example. Transphobic content was removed from GTA 5. I don't oppose that. Though I often wonder if warnings are sufficient. I don't know. I also oppose Kodocons showing up in spaces that aren't dedicated to hentai, because I don't want to run the risk of distressing anyone who accidentally comes across it. What I oppose is the censorship of information. That is, if I'm to censor something, I would be upfront and honest about what's being censored and why. I don't want to pretend distressing content doesn't exist, and I don't want to suppress info about it. Maybe I'm pro-censorship with extra steps or anti-censorship with extra steps, but I just don't see it as a binary. To the topic at hand, I don't see any good reasons for banning Kodocon. I also don't think it's practical with how widespread and accessible the internet is. It's not practical to attempt to suppress patterns of attraction that give rise to such art. Patterns not based in any belief that it's okay to commit CSA or anything like that. That's more of an anti-thing. Which reminds me... So the next video... It's a remake of a private video I've already uploaded to the channel over a year ago that I've set to be published in the event I'm compromised, like say, I'm doxxed by aunties. It's a very special video to me, and I can't believe I'm at the point already where I get to talk about it. So look forward to that. Until then, I just want to say that it's good to be back with kick-ass new hardware and several cases of anti-fuckery ahead of me. Take care and stay safe, everyone. I'll see you later.